let's do some keys. Need a DPS. Hop on your fire mage.
Nah, dude. I'll play Elemental.
The fuck? You have no skill with the spec. Your gear is shit for the 15. And did I mention you have no skill?
I mean, you are right, but at the same time, chain lightning into earthquake.
Man, I don't even know why the fuck I'm trying anymore.
Yeah, you better recognize. Alright, but you still need talents, gear, covenants, rotation, legendaries, and a bunch more stuff, because Elemental Shaman ain't easy. But don't tell Marcelian that, because he'll just make me play fire.
Hey! Is your combustion ready?
Shh. But you know what I do have ready?
What?
The subscribe and bell thingy, man. Goddamn shit, you know I'm subscribed to the channel.
Alright.
But are you? I mean, this isn't anything new. You know the drill. It helps out our channel grow, gives the video more views into more people, and bombs the new shit straight to your YouTube page. So, win-win, right? Appreciate the love and everything, dude. Now, let's jump into Elemental. Starting off with the first row, you have two options based on what the content you want to do is. Echo of the Elements is the universal choice and the better one in raids, although it's also good in dungeons. It gives you a second charge of Lava Burst, and making Lava Surge refund a charge instead of resetting the cooldown is pretty good. This changes your rotation a bit and offers flexibility when optimizing your Lava Burst damage, since you can essentially keep Lava Burst unused if there is still a charge left that's currently cooling down. You don't lose any DPS by doing this, and helps you time your instant surges into windows of mobility and repositioning. Alternatively, Earthen Rage is your mythic plus choice if you want to simplify your rotation, in that this is a passive that just works without any input from you and still does decent damage. In large AoE fights, Lava Burst will start to lose priority over Chain Lightning, making Echo less viable, hence Earthen Rage. Also, having a passive and fewer globals to spend on meatballs opens up the avenue for you to use utility, crowd controls, and other abilities that usually don't have a place in a raid scenario where your main goal is just to pump as much damage into your one target, although certain fights like Sun King with those pesky infusers might see you use some slows and stuns and such. Second row also brings with it two options. For raiding, or if you want to focus on single target damage output, Elemental Blast is your go-to. The effects of it are pretty straightforward. You will want to cast it on cooldown as much as possible without any impact to your rotation, outside putting it over other abilities in terms of priority. Otherwise, when fighting in dungeon keys, Aftermath will win out. The chaotic nature of Mythic Plus and the necessity of you needing to deal with large packs of mobs at once makes this a much better option over Elemental Blast. Also, although RNG, or because it's RNG, you have the chance to proc back-to-back Aftermaths, letting you stack those earthquakes for a lot of damage even outside your DPS cooldowns. This gives you consistency over the course of a dungeon and makes the spec feel engaging and actually useful when your elemental or other cooldowns are recharging. Another option for mythic dungeons and AoE scenarios, Echoing Shock, the new talent, tends to offer more burst potential while not being too far behind Aftermath. You can pair it with Earth Shock in single target and Earthquake in AoE, and it will copy the baseline version of the spell and replicate it on the target. We recommend Aftermath, but feel free to pick your poison. On the third row, Spirit Wolf is a good default. The move speed and damage reduction have their uses here and there, particularly in this season where the raid at least has sometimes large periods of downtime where you either have to take shit out of the raid, wait for the bosses to be available to hit, and so on, during which damage is rolled out on the raid or you just need to move from A to B. Alternatively, Earth Shield is a cheap defensive for yourself or someone else, where you are willing to put some healing surges on whoever has it, or simply keep it on yourself for some passive healing. Seeing as how you really only have one main cooldown outside using Earth Elemental with a Conduit for bonus HP, having Sustain will pay off in the end after a long fight. Either way, pick what you know you will get the most out of. For the fourth row, Master of the Elements will end up doing the best in raids and usually single target, although you can definitely pick it in Mythic Plus. Master of the Elements will add a twist to your rotation a bit, but nothing major. There's an argument about min-maxing its efficacy, but that can backfire if you mess up your rotation and cause you capping on resources or wasting cooldowns. Still, it's the best raid option and warrants the extra effort to play it efficiently. Overall, its performance is consistent in dungeons as well, and will be our recommendation as you start your elemental journey, regardless of the content you do. For dungeons specifically, when you can time your pulls better and make use of a more coordinated group, and arguably a more difficult talent than it leads to believe, Storm Elemental will come into play. The talent will pull ahead in AoE scenarios only if you take Primal Elementalist down the line, which we will get to in a second. Seeing as how the meta is a bit chaotic, pug tanks are unpredictable and almost every tank will kite at one point, having the Eye of the Storm Elemental ability to deal AoE regardless of how much the mobs are moving is very useful. Liquid Magma Totem is not bad, but a bit too restrictive, and it's hard enough to get your tank to keep mobs in your Earthquake. Although you might be able to get more out of it in an AoE fight that lasts for a very short amount of time. Smaller and more frequent pulls can favor the damage profile of a 1 minute cooldown that gets its value from a 15-second duration as opposed to the 30 seconds or more of the Storm Elemental. The fifth row is another pick your own poison row based on your playstyle and how the content treats you. Nature's Guardian is an all-rounder. You get healed for a decent chunk of your HP when it drops below 35%. Simple, passive, nothing to manage, and essentially can save your butt every 45 seconds. You have to think of it as an overall safety net and not actually rely on it when shit hits the fan. Use Astral Shift for the love of God. Ancestral Guidance is a good option for group healing. If you pair it with your DPS cooldowns, and you should, it will heal injured allies based on your damage output. Injured. Yes, as in it targets players that are injured as a priority, similar to Mistweaver healing if you are familiar with the spec. This is a group utility after all, so might be more useful if you have a bit of knowledge and communication with your group. Or if you play with tunnel vision people that just jump on the gas and forget that they have a break and it's just go, 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 go. It's good to have one of these things in emergencies where your healers or healer cannot keep up with everybody else. Wind Rush Totem is a personal favorite. You put a totem down that boosts the speed of everyone who passes through it for 6 seconds after they leave its area of effect. This has uses in all content. Think Sire, all phases based on your group strategy, Hungering Destroyer, Council Dance phase, Sanguine Deaths, etc. Need I go on? It's always good to give your group an unexpected burst of speed or your tank the chance to kite. The limitations of the skills are as much as your creativity allows. Moving down to a more exciting row, Ice Fury will be your mathematical best raid option. It's good for priority damage and will not lose out when fighting in cleave fights. It adds a lot of instant casts in the form of empowered frost shocks to your rotation that offer you some really good damage output either on the move or allows you to position during the fight without losing out on your DPS. It can add a layer of complexity when thinking about your rotation priority, but beats spamming lightning bolts. Outside heavy movement fights, you won't get as much usage from it, and although using it efficiently can give you an edge, the difficulty it comes with brings a big risk in fucking it up, where you would lose more damage than with the alternative. Speaking of which, for starting off your elemental experience, and if you are raiding heroic where the movement is not as intense, Primal Elementalist will pick up the slack and give you a less punishable performance in pretty much all content. This one is also a simpler one to use, at least to start off, although its min-maxing will require some practice. On paper, it will make your elemental way stronger. It also enables Storm Elemental to be actually viable, like we mentioned before. Also, your elemental will now have an AoE ability that will come in handy in dungeons. Translate this into the Earth Elemental and you can relieve your tank of some stress for a decent amount of time that actually gets shorter and shorter the higher the key is. Still, giving him or her the small window to kite, drop stacks, or recoup can make the difference between a wipe or a successful pack clear. Lastly, Stormkeeper is still king on the last row. It's a 1 minute cooldown with some burst damage potential, and then single target will deal some decent lightning bolt damage, obviously instant, while can net some really serious pain when buffed by Master of the Elements. In AoE, on a large enough pack, one Stormkeeper Chain Lightning will very likely fill your entire Maelstrom bar. For both raids and dungeons, a 1 minute cooldown will usually be preferred. You cannot always deal the most amount of damage you want at any point in time. Either there is downtime or something unexpected happens. So on-demand, short, and often burst cooldowns match the content design a bit better. As always, if you want to know either what your stat priority is or what the best item to equip is, you have to sim. Simming is actually pretty quick once you get the hang of it. Raidboss.com does a fairly good job at offering you a lot of answers for gearing questions, but I get not everyone is that interested or dedicated to jump to a third-party platform to tell them what to equip. Although the game evolved to this point, there are still some basic priorities to stats based on your playstyle. Intellect will be the king, no matter what. That means eye level will be superior in every scenario, and whatever gives you intellect over secondary stats will more often than not be the best choice. In raids, where you will ideally run the Windspeaker's legendary, which we will discuss later on, versatility and haste are fairly tight at the top. The one you have the least of will likely be the better to focus on at that point. Critical Strike comes next with mastery close to it, but still behind the other two options. For AoE scenarios where you will ideally not use the Windspeaker's legendary, crit will reign supreme, filled by haste and versatility, with mastery even lower, seemingly losing more and more strength the more targets you end up fighting at once. Again, this is purely suggestive, to at least give you a sense of what to look for. For this and enchants, foods and such, you need to know your best stat first. We will still recommend a list of consumables for the sake of completion, which won't lose you DPS if your stat weights differ, but might not be the best answer for all elementals in all scenarios. Use the Celestial Guidance enchant for the weapon. It will proc with an intellect buff, quite often actually, and it will translate into good damage both in AoE and single target. For the chest, Eternal Stats will be an overall good choice, with an added recommendation of wearing the Heavy Desolate Armor kit if you are pushing hard content or are under geared. It never hurts to make it easier for your healers to save your butt, plus the Nature's Guardian talent scales with your HP, so there's a bonus there. Eternal Intellect for your bracers is a no-brainer since there is no real other option there, and a Fortified Avoidance enchant for your cloak will add a few percentages of damage reduction on AoE spells that hit you periodically both in raids and in prideful keys. For the sockets and rings, Quick Jewel Clusters and Tenet of Haste are good if you plan on doing both raiding and mythic dungeons. Alternatively, since these are easy to replace, feel free to swap them with whatever secondary stat equivalent you need or sim to be the strongest for yourself. In the alchemy department, the Potion of Spectral Intellect will cover all your DPS needs regardless of the content you do, while the flask, as always, will be the Spectral Flask of Power, and you can still put the Shadow Core oil on your weapon for that min-maxing DPS. Since Intellect reigns supreme, Feast should be an obvious choice of food buff, although realistically they will only be available in raiding scenarios, while outside or as a replacement, the Tenebrous Crone Roast aspect fits that haste need that can be swapped out like we mentioned before. Covenants are surprisingly well balanced the more the devs seem to aim at tuning them. If you are not interested in getting every bit of damage out of your character and are willing to sack a few percentages of DPS for the flavor and experience, pick what you like and you will be fine. Otherwise, the two best Covenants right now by a small margin are Necrolords and the Night Fae. Overall, we recommend Necrolords for all content. The damage potential is slightly behind Night Fae, but they are more versatile, give you a bit more freedom, and if we will talk about the meta, are possibly the least populated one, which statistically means that you will have more value overall in a group. Statistically, Fleshcraft has been changed to also act as a 20% damage reduction while channeling if for some reason you are in a situation where you are actively taking a lot of damage and in danger of dying. Primordial Wave is also one of the more satisfying abilities to use. If anything, is the most interesting to optimize, at least in AoE. Your best soulbind by far will be Bonesmith Hymir, mostly because of her Arsenal Marrowed Gemstone that gives you a big chunk of crit chance once you landed 10 critical strikes on enemies, which is decently often. This is of course at max renown, but right now getting to max renown, if you are not there yet, shouldn't take more than a couple of dedicated days. Plus the transmog is way cooler, and I rest my case. The Night Fae comes with Fae Transfusion, which deals a stupid amount of damage, and Soul Shape that is the answer to almost all mobility issues, which Elemental doesn't have, at least not that many between Ghost Wolf and a lot of instant cast spells. However, in raids, Nia with Nia's Tools Burrs will output the most amount of damage out of any Covenant and Soulbind choice. Since the damage from that particular trait comes from the ground effect under the supposed boss, the restriction doesn't make it viable in dungeon scenarios where shit moves a lot, or any boss that's at least chaotically tanked half the time. And this is DPS potential on paper. Same thing with Corraine in Mythic Plus dungeons and his first strike and wall hunt tactics. These last two are arguably the best in the game for AoE potential, and again with a twist, they are not bad, just restrictive, and either one of the two soulbinds taken will make you give up on the other's damage profile. Which is why we recommend Necrolords, because of the transmog, and the fact that Heimer does not have drawbacks whether you are in raids or dungeons. And transmog. And that's all well and good, but what about actual conduits? Well, things haven't changed much since our last guide on the spec. Call of Flame is still the best one to pick in all scenarios, hands down. The second potency conduit is your Covenant's ability conduit, which in your case will be Tumbling Waves, if you went with what we recommended, of course. The only exception to this is Venthyr, which will want Pyroclastic Shock. These are mostly for reference, since most good Soulbind builds will see only one potency slot available, making Call of Flame your only real choice. As for endurance options, Vital Accretion will make your Earth Elemental buff your max HP, as mentioned earlier. This comes in handy in heavy AoE damage scenarios where the extra HP gives your healer enough time to get you back up, or simply ignore you to handle a more pressing group member that's about to die. Refreshing Waters is the other endurance option if you are inclined to healing surging yourself a lot. This normally shouldn't be the case outside solo content like World Quests and Torghast. Lastly, in the finesse slots, Thunderous Paws will give your Ghost Wolf a small burst of speed when activated, kind of, but not really, but almost replacing Soul Shape if it was ever a reason to go Night Fae 4. Spiritual Resonance can be a DPS gain in certain scenarios by allowing you to cast on the move. Similarly to the stats section, the best answer as to what trinket to equip is to sim. You can also check websites like bloodmallet.com to get an idea of how trinkets rank against each other. If you are still not interested in third-party tools to tell you what's what, Kabbalist Hymnal is one of the best trinkets to aim for. It, together with the Glyph of Assimilation, both come from the raid. The latter one has a knack to it when it comes to getting the most out of its value though. If you like to PvP, the PvP trinkets, Sinful Gladiator's Badge of Ferocity and Insignia of Alacrity, can be easy trinkets to acquire without the added stress of RNG. Badge is also a safe trinket to use since it will align with every Stormkeeper, which makes it good since your 2.5 minute elemental doesn't really have a lot of good options in terms of trinket pairing. Soul-Letting Ruby comes close though, especially if you take the Skybreaker's legendary. Speaking of which, this is as good of a time as any to talk about the Skybreaker's Fiery Demise. Essentially, this will reduce the cooldown of Storm Elemental, because you would likely want to use it in dungeons with the talent build we suggested, although not restricted to that only. This legendary lives and breathes on your ability to maintain 3 to 4 flame shocks up, or as many as your targets allow, for maximum cooldown reduction. This will mean that your damage profile in dungeons will change on top of Rising, of course, where you will have your biggest cooldown for almost all important packs and bosses. This is also good in weeks where your tank will kite a lot. Sanguine, Necrotic, Raging, whatever will make the mobs get out of your Earthquake, because otherwise Echoes of the Great Sundering has the most AoE damage potential. It gets better the more targets you have that actually stay in your Earthquakes, and is really good in single target as well, where your Earthquakes will be weaved in your rotation. Generally, this will be the best legendary in all content if your goal is 1 and 1 only to craft. Alternatively, for pure single target and only a few percentages above Echoes, you have Wind Speaker's Lava Resurgence. This is the best for raiding and pure single target damage output. It will change your stat priority like we mentioned before, and it's still a pretty fun legendary to play with. The Lava Surge procs it gives offers you more instant casts that can be used for positioning and mobility, further decreasing the need to talent into Ice Fury for most raid fights. Pick what you want. Personally, I have all three, and let me tell you, it's hard to get bored of Elemental when you can swap through 3 almost different playstyles on the fly. With the raid build we recommended, you open with a precast Stormkeeper and Fire Elemental before the pool, around 5 seconds-ish. Precast Elemental Blast, use Primordial Wave, follow it up with Lava Burst, then fire instant Lightning Bolt. Lava Burst again, then Lightning Bolt again, cast Ice Fury, and continue to the normal priority rotation. When precasting, you want to be careful to not precast too early and not have the boss selected when using your Fire Ellie, which can pull the boss early and or if you have the trinkets like Glyph of Assimilation that instantly debuff the target and pull the boss if macroed with one of your cooldowns. To actually make sure Fire Ellie will not pull the boss, use this macro right here, where you will not fuck up like Flame, and be able to still precast your shit just right. As far as the single target priority goes, as in the most important to the least ability to cast, you start by making sure Flame Shock is on the target. Use your Fire or Storm Elemental on cooldown. Earth also if you are not running Primal Elementalist, because you might despawn your DPS Elemental that way. Earth Shock to prevent capping Maelstrom. Elemental Blast on cooldown next. Cast Stormkeeper on cooldown as well. Primordial Wave on cooldown, so as long as the previous buff was already consumed. Cast Lightning Bolt next if buffed by Stormkeeper and Master of the Elements. Cast Ice Fury on cooldown if you are about to move due to a mechanic. Use Frost Shocks if they are buffed by both Ice Fury and Master of the Elements. Lava Burst next. Flame Shock to refresh the existing one if it has less than 6 seconds remaining. Earth Shock next if at 60 or more Maelstrom. Frost Shock if it's buffed by Ice Fury. Ice Fury next if you know you won't have to move within the next 30 seconds. And fill in with Lightning Bolt. The idea here is to set a mindset for you to understand how important each spell is compared to the rest based on what buffs you have up. It doesn't matter if I cap resources in this section or not, the idea is to give you a visual cue on what to think about when you are in mid-fight. When in dungeons fighting packs of mobs, cast your Storm Elemental on cooldown and Earth Elemental once the previous one expires. Primordial Wave next to refresh Flame Shock. Keep Stormkeeper on cooldown. Cast Eye of the Storm after your Storm Ellie uses its Call Lightning ability, which happens automatically and has a visual cue to look for. You can use the macro on the screen for it, by the way. Pop Earth Shock to proc the Echoes of the Great Sundering buff if not already active. Use Earthquake if the buff is active and you are about to cap on Maelstrom or you have the Master of the Elements buff. Fill in with Chain Lightning. If you are not using the Great Sundering Legendary, try to maintain as many Flame Shocks on enemies as you can and forget about Earth Shocks unless you have a priority target. On 3 or more targets, start using Stormkeeper with Chain Lightning. Even though this sees you weaving in Earth Shocks to buff Earthquake, when fighting a single target, you can use the single target priority with adding Earthquakes instead of every other Earth Shock. So essentially, you spend Maelstrom on Earth Shock to generate the buff, then Earthquake to consume it, regardless of the number of targets you are fighting. This was a quick pick-me-up rotation to get you going, but depending on your covenant and how much you are willing to dive deep into Elemental, there are more intricacies to the spec which you can check in the Earth Shrine Discord community, where the best and the brightest reside to answer questions from mortals like ourselves. You can also check the online written guides on Wowhead by GistWiki, Icy Veins by Stormy, and of course the Storm, Earth and Lava website for all that elemental goodness. A special thank you to Stormy who helped feedback our guide and make sure that we got all the information accurate for you. Thank you, dude. And of course, a special thank you to the Patreons as always for supporting the channel. Thank you very much, guys. All of the Patreons you see on this wonderful list over here have supported us, and we are very grateful for them. They make a lot of this possible. And hey, if you, dear viewer, also want to support us a little bit more, check the link down below. Thank you very much for watching the video. See you next time.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.